Hi, welcome to WLRN and our airwaves here. I have Susan Hawthorne with me today. It's an honor to have you here, Susan. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to be interviewed by you today and talk about my book.
Yeah, so I'm going to just let our listeners know a bit about you before we dive into talking about your book. Um, Dr. Susan Hawthorne holds a PhD in political science and women's studies and has written extensively about ecology, radical feminism, economics, war, and international relations. In recent years, she has researched the terrible torture of lesbians and written about human rights in relation to lesbians. She has held a number of positions in universities, most recently as adjunct professor in the writing program at James Cook University, Townsville, and has supervised postgraduate students in fiction, poetry, and publishing studies for almost 20 years. She is also co-founder and director of the independent feminist publishing house, Spinifex Press, which publishes international and local feminist books and ebooks. So again, welcome, Susan. It's truly an honor to have you on WLRN's airwaves. Can you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself and the founding of Spinifex Press?
Well, you'll have to actually buy the book to find out more because I can't summarize it too quickly. I grew up on a farm with a mother who read Rachel Carson and Kate Millett's books before I did. I was in my late teens at that stage. I joined the women's liberation movement in 1973 and very quickly became intensely involved in the movement and finished up writing what's called an honours thesis in Australia, which is a fourth year in philosophy it was, on separatism. And subsequent to that, I have had a very erratic, you wouldn't call it a career, I've had a very erratic job thing. I worked a lot of different jobs, including teaching swimming, teaching English to Arabic-speaking women, working in Aboriginal education, and with unemployed youth and a whole lot of other things. And then because I had been unemployed for such a long time, I got a job, really proper job, it seemed like at the time, organising a women's writing festival. I was actually the writing, theatre and music coordinator of this festival. So I got to do lots of really fascinating stuff. And that's what really got me into publishing, although I did work for another year at a university in Aboriginal education following that. And then I applied for a job at Penguin Books, got it. No, actually, the first time round I didn't get it, and then I did. And after 4 years working there as an editor, as a commissioning editor and then senior editor, Renate and I decided that we would set up Spinifex Press. We did that because we were both very worried about the direction the publishing was taking. At Penguin, I noticed that there wasn't the same energy around publishing books that were new and different. A whole lot of books I really thought should have been published weren't published. We both noticed that in the bookshops, postmodernism was taking over the space where feminist books had previously sat. And also the feminist books that were there were not being reviewed to the same degree and were not being incorporated into women's studies courses and the like. So we decided to set up Spinifex. We thought maybe we would last a year. but we're now, what is it? It'll be 34 years at the beginning of next year. And we knew that we wanted to publish radical feminist books. We wanted to publish books by lesbian writers. We wanted to publish books that were critical of postmodernism. And as well as that, because of my publishing background at Penguin and my organising of a writers' festival and so forth, I was also really committed to publishing books by Indigenous writers, women who had migrated to Australia, lesbians, working class women, women with disability, those sorts of what is now called diversity publishing, but in 1980, in the late 80s and early 90s, it didn't have a name. We just did it, and we kind of did it automatically. And Renate had also been writing about diversity in universities, so we were out there doing this before there was a name for it, and of course that is no longer recognised. I mean, we are never asked to speak about that, even though in Australia we probably have one of the longest histories of doing that sort of work. And well, we've been very lucky to have some wonderful women working with us in editorial and marketing and so forth over the years. And but it's hard work. I have to say, it's hard work, and it's hard work to keep going. And
Why? I have a quick question. Why did you expect that it wasn't going to last this long when you first started out?
Well, because I had already seen a number of publishing houses come and go, small ones. But in our first year we only had 4 books, so we were very small at that point. I did begin to realise after going to the American Book Fair in the early 90s that in fact what it really took was you had to last at least 30 years to have much impact. So the fact that we have made it to that point really pleases me. And the other publishing houses, feminist publishing houses that are around that I find really interesting are 2 in India, one called Women Unlimited, another Zuban, which came out of a press called Kali for Women, and that's been going for 40 years. So there are some wonderful models out there.
Mm-hmm. And where do Spinifex Press books get distributed? If I go to Barnes and Noble, can I buy a book from Spinifex Press?
I don't know, actually. The answer is certain. When we first started, because there were so many more feminist bookshops in the US, we were able to sell lots of books, even though we only had, maybe a dozen titles at the time, maybe up to 20. But because of the demise of the feminist bookstores, most sales, some go through Barnes and Noble, but I wouldn't know which stores. The vast majority go through the demon Amazon.
And you order them on.
So, and our books are also available in some Canadian bookstores and things like that, but it's hit and miss, really. And they are also available directly from our distributor, who's called IPG, ipgbook.com. And so, you can subvert the system and go directly to them. But the visibility in bookstores has become very difficult.
And do you sell to some universities too? Are there professors of women's studies that are receiving these books and teaching them in their course load?
Well, we would if we could, but there are very few women's studies courses now. That has also something that has died out. Now it's culture studies and trans studies and all sorts of other studies that don't have much to do with feminism or women's studies. We certainly used to, but I frankly I think that the women's studies system is in pretty dire shape.
Yeah. let's hope the pendulum swings back um, for our young women's sake, especially. Um, so we're here today to talk about this book. I'm just gonna hold it up. That was published recently, called Lesbian: Politics, Culture, Existence, and it's a collection of your work over the years. And so there are lots of essays in there that are really densely packed with information and theory and stories, and I really enjoyed reading it. I wanted to ask you if you would define lesbian separatism for us and how that is reconciled with lesbian inclusion in the larger society, because you hear these are buzzwords, right? Inclusion is something that the trans movement uses a lot, is that we need to be inclusive, and they use that as an excuse to exclude um, lesbians from a lot of things that we should be included in. um, so can you talk about lesbian separatism, what that is exactly, and how inclusion fits with that and doesn't fit with that?
It's actually an incredible irony, isn't it, that inclusion is used as a way to exclude. But to go on to separatism, I actually write about separatism rather than lesbian separatism, because separatism is something that women who are heterosexual can also engage in. And I talk about, basically, separatism is a political strategy. It's a political strategy that any group of oppressed people will engage in order to build their community, to build their strengths, like to have workshops about, how to talk to the media, and make sure that that workshop is for women, run by women, about women. Now, that's a kind of minimal version of separatism, but it is an important version. And I talk about a range of different ways. I do view that separatism does have to have a political element to it. So, although actually in recent years, it is possible to have things like afternoon teas, say for a group of lesbians, and that has become a political act, because lesbians are so excluded and unable to meet legally anymore. Certainly in Australia, there are real problems with this. So while I said it had to be political, it can be political simply by doing it. And the other thing is that, when the civil rights movement happened, I mean, that was black people who engaged together, organised together, and so forth. They probably didn't call it separatism, but no doubt within their community that they built their community through separatist activities. And women doing that is also engaging in separatism. The difference between that and, say, the working class or the civil rights movement or Black Lives Matter or whatever, is that women are expected to love men. And that changes the nature of it, that separatism for women is a really strongly political act. And so I think that, women's studies started out as primarily courses for women. I did participate in a group at university where one man joined the course, and really he disrupted and disrupted and disrupted. It was not a good experience. So, those are the kinds of things that I count as separatism. On the sort of stronger level, where women, mostly lesbians, but not all, went off into the countryside and bought land and lived on the land with only women there. And that, I think, was an extraordinarily brave and inspirational thing to do. And there was a group in Australia. The first one was called Amazon Acres, and then there was Herland, and so forth. And they have operated. They still exist. And a series of books was put out in the last few years, put together by Sand Hall, who'd been involved in that over many years. And yeah, the inspirational level of that, I think, is terribly important. And women, the sort of funny edge of it is that women now talk about how they had fights about nails, whether it was okay to hammer nails into wood or whether you had to do it differently. So because of course a nail is a masculine item. And they were trying to disrupt absolutely everything. So it did go down
because it's like it's phallic. It's a phallic.
Well, possibly. I think more that it was an iron tool, but many different ways. So they laugh about that now, but it's an indicator of the kind of level of thinking that went into that. And the women in those places tell the most remarkable stories about their times there, the attacks they suffered from some members of the local community, but they also talk about the good men in the local community who assisted them at various times. So some man with a tractor who helped clear the road, things like that. So that for me, they're all examples of separatism, but I wouldn't call it lesbian separatism, because that I think is not hugely helpful in the long run.
Okay, because it's a political strategy that can be used by any minority group, any oppressed group to
Yes,
organize and fight the oppression. Okay.
that's correct. Yep.
Wonderful. And also, you in your book, you definitely want lesbians to be recognized in the larger society for the contributions that we make. I mean, I can't remember which essay it was, but in several essays you talk about lesbian women making contributions to the larger society. And if everyone knew that these women were lesbian, like, that would be really great, because often they don't talk about the woman's sexuality when she makes big contributions to the larger society. But is a large percentage of the women who make contributions that are very visible contributions in our society that are lesbian. So that's the inclusion part, I think, that you are getting at, is that you want lesbians to be recognized and honored and given credit for what we contribute to society.
I guess I wouldn't call that inclusion, partly because I think inclusion has become such a problematic word. I would call it recognition, respect, a whole range of things like that. That if a woman achieves something, often what happens is that her achievement is recognized. If she has done something bad, then she's called, her lesbian sexuality is highlighted. And so it becomes a double thing. A writer like, New Zealand economist and politician Marilyn Waring, who wrote a book, Counting for Nothing, or it had a different title in the US. It might be Counting for Something. It's all about the recognition of women's work in the UN system of national accounts. And she's well known as a lesbian, but that doesn't appear anywhere in her book. But I do wonder whether that because she is a lesbian, that she was able to see things in the different societies that she was looking at, economically speaking, because she was doing it with a lesbian eye. And I think you know, she's well known, so I'm not outing her or anything like that. But even these days, it is actually important to be aware of the sensitivities around that, because being a lesbian can destroy a woman's career. And so many lesbians are not publicly known as lesbians until after they've died. And it's very frustrating and awful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's funny though, because in today's world with the LGBTQ WTF, you can even you get asked regularly, like at the doctor's office, what's your sexual orientation? Or it's become a question that's like a normal question to ask, at least in Madison, liberal Madison. And supposedly lesbians are held up because we're in the LGBTQ, and the LGBTQ is held up. But as you know, and as I know, that's not really the case. So lesbians who keep their mouth shut about the harms of trans activism and the harms of patriarchy, um, they get to be out and proud, But lesbians who are political lesbians, they still are at a huge risk of. I mean, I lost my job because I spoke
Mm.
openly about trans activism being misogynistic. Um, so it's kind of interesting with how society has evolved. I feel like it's inappropriate. It's like you're applying for a job and they ask you what your sexual orientation is. I'm like,
Yes,
that's none of your business. It has nothing to do with the job. But because we've advanced and we're so progressive now, it's like, oh, you can just ask anybody what their sexual orientation is. So,
yes. I haven't been sacked, but that's because I don't have a paying job. I mean, I'd have to sack myself. Um, so in a way, that's a plus, that I'm not dependent on an income from somewhere else. I am dependent on an income from my writing. And I know that I've been silenced, and I know that my books are not reviewed to the same extent. I'm not invited to writers' festivals and the likes. So there are other ways of doing it other than sacking somebody. And that in itself is problematic, because that means that the voices of radical feminists on writers' festivals now is pretty much non-existent. You do, as you say, see some lesbians, but they are of the trans ally variety of lesbian, um, and mostly they call themselves queer.
yeah. Something you address in your book, that word queer, and how it's sort of this catch-all phrase. Anybody can be queer, and it's become meaningless, really, in a lot of ways.
Yes,
Um,
and that's the problem with inclusion as well, that it increases the level of meaninglessness in the society.
yeah, yeah. We need to have respect for words, that they have
Yes.
meaning and impact, and we don't want to dumb things down. We want our words to be meaningful and precise, and to say what we mean. And yeah, so all these buzzwords that progressives and liberals use these days to virtue signal and make them seem like they're all, inclusive of everyone, and on this road towards social justice. It's like you have to be cautious and wary, and it's unfortunate. A thread in many of your writings is to group Indigenous, migrant, working class, and lesbian together. Why is it important to put these groups together when you're weaving your theory and telling your story? What do lesbian struggles have in common with other oppressed groups, and what sets lesbians apart?
Well, I would also add to that list disability, because that's also a very big concern of mine. And the reason why I do that is because these are the things that I've been engaged with over the years. And when I ran a writers' festival in 1985, we had full days on Indigenous writing, working class writing, migrant writing, lesbian writing. We didn't have a day on disability, but that was a gap. And although I spoke about that because I suffer from epilepsy, and so it was there, but not as a theme. And when I went to work at Penguin, I decided that what I would do is I'd try to unwork the system, as in Valerie Solanas' idea of subverting things. And so I worked to have books by lesbians, migrant women, Indigenous women, and men actually as well. And that was terribly important for me, because I wanted the words of those writers to be heard, to be visible, to be regarded well, to be reviewed, and to enter the culture. Because if you only have a culture of white men, mostly wealthy, it's not really very interesting, as we discovered. And one of the reasons why some of the books that I managed to get published during that time were successful is because they were different. The sales department wanted to have, how is this book the same as whatever other book? Because then they would know how to promote it. The editorial and publishing department wanted to know, how is this book unique? How is it different from every other book in the market? So those two elements in the mainstream publishing world were really fighting against one another. And so when we started Spinifex, we decided to put them together and make sure that there was not an argument, there was, expansion in a way.
Yeah. Well, we're so glad you did. We're so glad that you started Spinifex Press, um, to include all of those voices and struggles. But how is the lesbian struggle? You talk about this in your book. Um, how is it
Mm.
different than other struggles of oppressed groups in a unique way, that sets lesbians apart?
Well, I mean, one of the things, and it's not entirely different, but there are some differences. Um, One is around the concept of shame. Even today, a lot of lesbians feel quite a bit of shame, which is why it's hard to be upfront about a woman's sexuality if you don't know for sure that she's out. Shame is still there. That has also applied in Australia, certainly to Aboriginal people who felt a lot of shame because, and they wouldn't be able to say I'm Aboriginal. They say I'm from India, or I'm from the South Sea Islands, or something like that. That was a bit better. In previous eras, being a working class, and certainly in England, the working class there often worked on their accents, so that they wouldn't be given away as having working class origin. So these are similar things, but for lesbians, that is still really operating. I think it probably is operating in other areas as well, but it is something that occurs for an oppressed group until things change. And some things have changed in those areas and some things have not. I think also, as I said at the beginning, lesbians are expected to love men. Now, men are almost half the population, and they're the power brokers in the system, which is set up for them. I mean, patriarchy really benefits men, even if they don't want to benefit from it. So for lesbians to really step right outside of that is really a big thing to do. Heterosexual women sometimes gain quite a bit economically when they ally themselves with a man. They also put themselves in danger sometimes.
Mhm.
So, there are pluses and minuses to that. I'm just trying to think the other thing is that being a lesbian is such an intimate thing. It goes to the heart of who we are. It's about our very strong feelings for or against others. It's about intimacy, about heart and soul, and all of those things. And while I think that plays out for others as well, certainly I would say that of Indigenous people, that their heart and soul and the land are very, very closely aligned. But it's still slightly different. So, but I think that the element of intimacy is something that is very different.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to switch gears here. I'm really curious about this because the internet has just taken off in the past 20 years. And in your essay in the book called Planting Roses, you expressed a very optimistic view, and this was in 1997, um, of the internet for lesbians and lesbian culture. And I'm just going to quote what you wrote. You wrote, quote, "The internet is fast becoming a source of communication between lesbians, and perhaps it can be more than that, since the internet creates a transparency that has not previously existed," unquote. Can you describe further how you viewed the internet then in 1997 and how you view it now, and if it's changed and if you still have such an optimistic view?
Um, I think it's really complicated. I'm I have very conflicted feelings about it. I think back then, yes, I was more um, happy about the internet because it was allowing lesbians in different countries to talk to one another, and that remains a really strong element, a very good part of the internet. But it has also allowed for those who hate us to attack us, and in some instances literally destroy the careers or the mental health or the lives of women who have spoken out. So what I was thinking about at the time when I wrote that piece was I was engaged in writing a series of poems which I called Unstopped Mouths. And it's basically a series of poems about lesbian culture. And what I was trying to say was that it would allow us to explore these things more generally, more, well, transparently, perhaps more publicly even. And that certainly has happened. I get a lot of Facebook posts about wonderful things in ancient societies or fantastic political actions in different countries, and so it's a way of being able to keep up with the women's movement, with lesbian activism internationally. So that's wonderful. In my sequence of poems, what was interesting, well, I did finish up publishing that in my book, The Butterfly Effect. And what was interesting was that I finished up writing a whole lot of footnotes to go on the opposite page to the poem. And as I was doing that, I realized, I thought about, now who was I writing these footnotes for? And if I had done it online, which I did have a go at, but I found it clunky and I'm not really a tech head, I found that footnotes were just as good. And thinking about who was I writing it for, I was really writing it for the lesbians who didn't yet know about our culture and the depth and strength of it. I realized I was also writing it potentially for heterosexual readers who may or may not know any of this. I don't know if I have any heterosexual readers of those poems. I probably have. And I hope that they were impressed at the depth of lesbian culture. But I've also been told in no uncertain words that lesbians have no culture. and I think, well, no, that's not true, because I am part of it and I know it, and we lesbians do know that there's very strong culture going back thousands of years. And I think that that's incredibly important to know about. So in some ways, I think that my idea that it would make some things more transparent has become the case. What I didn't anticipate was the level of attacks that we would also be subjected to because of that.
Yeah. And also the distribution of pornography and
Yeah.
how that's and the social media that's just out of control, and you know, people being so connected to their devices all day long
Mm.
on social media that they miss what's happening right in front of them, and those types of things. Back in 1997, I don't know that we had an idea that it was going to be that way. Um,
Mm.
so, like any tool, right? There are good uses and there are bad uses for the tool, and I think in most recent years we've seen some pretty bad uses of the internet and social media, unfortunately. Um, so
Actually,
I was
can I
really,
just
okay.
come in there and just say, um, just read two lines from a poem, which is what finishes off the book. I've just got to find it here. Oh, I can't find it. Ah, here it is, page 69. The poem is called Things a Lesbian Should Know. And the poem is the final piece in the book. But it goes back to what I was saying about the culture of lesbians going back thousands of years, and it's important for us to know that. And it's called Things a Lesbian Should Know. And the poem begins that the lesbian is as old as humanity and maybe older. How to conjugate the verb to love in any tongue. And for me, that those two lines say quite a bit about our culture as lesbians. And I wanted to have that as part of my book, because I wanted to say some things in my book I wanted to say through poems.
Yes, and I like how you ended the book with that poem. It's very appropriate. Um, I enjoyed that, and to think that lesbians existed since the beginning of humanity is really important for us to know that we matter, and that we've had a hand in the shaping of how things have gone and the evolution of our species. You know,
Mm.
it's very comforting. That poem I found to be comforting in a lot of ways. Um, so switching gears again, I was really taken by your essay on lesbian economics, because I'm experimenting now with living on the land, women's land, and trying to create a lesbian culture and a lesbian community that's a land-based community. So that essay on lesbian economics really stood out for me. Um, and under the subheading in your essay, the subheading complexity economics, you write, and I'm going to quote again from the book. Here's the book in case our viewers would like to see this beautiful cover again. It's a wonderful book available through Spinifex Press, and I'd like to encourage all of our WLRN listeners to order it and to ask your public library to carry it as well. That's always a wonderful act that women can take for feminism is to go to your public library and ask them to shelve Dworkin, or shelve any books from Spinifex Press. So, under the subheading Complexity Economics, you write, economics has developed out of androcentric ontologies and and has been spread throughout the colonizing fervor of European derived societies. Its reliance on the idea that economic information arises from a normative heterosexual universe means that almost all economic theories are depoliticized. The consequence is a homogeneity, and standardization that are inappropriately universalized and which reflect the methodologies of colonization and domination. So, yeah, I mean, heterosexual economics, heterosexuality, it's very much like the air we breathe. We don't even see it. We don't it just feels like that's the way things are. But yet I'm really getting this feeling from your book and especially from that essay that the way to subvert patriarchy is for us to create a different kind of economics, a lesbian economics. Um, and so to what extent is it important for women to become lesbians, and to focus our energies solely on building our relationships with each other in order to transform society from one of dominance and submission under capitalist patriarchy into one that is woman loving and based on sharing, mutual aid, and cooperation? Um, so, can you talk about that a little bit, please? Thank you.
How many hours do you have?
Yeah.
I mean, well, I mean, in some ways, I summed it up in those 2 lines from that poem. That's what poetry is for, to be able to say things like that. I mean, economics. I was not interested in economics at all for the first 30 years of being a feminist. I just thought it was terribly boring. Then I went to Bangladesh for a conference and spent several days in a group led by Maria Mies, a German economist, philosopher, sociologist. And after that, I wrote a short 3-page manifesto called Wild Politics. And I read it out and got very good response to it. And a couple of women, including Maria and Jenna Correa, said, you've got to turn this into a book. It's not enough. 3 pages is not enough, but there's some good ideas there. So I decided that I needed to read up on economics, which I did. Now, I did not find a lot of lesbian economists to read. Prue Hyman is one of the exceptions, New Zealand writer, radical feminist, lesbian, and all around extraordinary woman. And she had written some essays on how lesbians are accounted and, seeing how that works within the system, and basically concluding that, lesbians were not visible really, and that in general, lesbians were not doing particularly well if you looked at income levels and things like that. But I also read a lot about ecological economics. I read up on economic theory from African writers. I read up on a whole lot of writers who were talking about complexity economics. I attended two feminist economics conferences. And so I began to think about what are the different ways that one can subvert economics. And when the feminist economics conference came to Sydney, I thought, here's my chance to think about it with a lesbian lens. I could not have done that if I hadn't known Prue and I hadn't read up on all these other perspectives on economics. And it struck me that coming at economics from a lesbian point of view really shattered the paradigm in lots of ways, because we just don't fit the model. We don't fit the model even for what you might call standardized heterosexual women within the economic sphere, such as Marilyn Waring writes about. How do you count the work of lesbians? In her work, she was able to show that women contributed enormously to the family survival, and that men tended to go off. They would earn money, drink money, smoke money, use money to have sex with other women, and buy petrol. So that they were key things that men would do. And Pat Hines has written about that, another lesbian who does fantastic work in this area. But if you have a lesbian partnership, how do you even count what lesbians are doing? I mean, if you can put it within the framework that already exists, but in general, lesbians will just sink through that framework and not be visible. So I'm still, in a way, I think I'm still struggling with this as a question, because these days, if you fill in a form, you have to put in LGBTIQ, as you say, WTF. And so the L completely disappears. And mostly it disappears because of the T. I no longer refer to the groups in that way. I talk about TQ plus and LGB, because they are two opposing groups with completely opposing philosophies and ideologies. Mm-hmm. So, but even in the LGB, if one brought it back to that, it's lesbian economics is still tricky. They speak about the pink dollar, but mostly they mean the gay male dollar when they're talking about that. Mardi Gras in Australia is a fabulous, exciting, and whatever kind of festival, but it's not an especially lesbian-oriented festival. In fact, lesbians find it harder and harder and harder to be visible as part of Mardi Gras, even though there were lesbians involved in the original year when Mardi Gras started. So, or I write about my experience in the women's circus, and the women's circus was set up in order for women who had been subjected to sexual assault to be able to come together to learn physical skills and so forth, and support one another. And the physical skills, part of that was reaffirming one's relationship to the body as well. And as a lesbian aerialist, it's how do I contribute to that? I have, but I wouldn't know whether I could put any number on it. In the same way that for culture, governments really, really struggle giving money to creative people, because they don't know how to value it. They don't know how to gauge what sort of value it has. In the same ways, they don't know how to value trees either. And lesbians are a bit like trees. I think we're a bit of a mystery in terms of how what we do, how we do it, can be valued. And in a way, I think, well, value might be overdone. Perhaps there are better ways to measure things, to gauge the success of things, rather than value.
Yeah, and especially value in the capitalist patriarchal system. I mean,
Yep.
What is the goal? How is lesbian economics different than it feels like lesbian economics is in resistance to capitalist patriarchal economics.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is the goal of lesbian economics?
I think that if I had a Venn diagram, I would overlap it with some other kinds of economics like ecological economics. But ecological economics has its own problems, because within that there are some people who I think are absolutely on the ball in terms of recognizing value and non-value, and the people who get it, like Indigenous people, get to have access to things that have no commercial value, whereas the rest, the country gets to have access to the things that can be sold commercially. So I think lesbian economics shares quite a bit with that. But for pornography, for example, I mean, lesbian economics would be marvelous. You know, you can buy and sell all sorts of dreadful things, including women. But on the lesbian economics that I think shares a lot with, say, Indigenous economics within an ecological framework rather than a commercial or capitalist or patriarchal framework, then I think that there are that there what's its point? The point is to make you think differently. The point is to create ways of looking at the world that are different, that are challenging, and where you have to work on your own assumptions. And, you know, patriarchal economics has so many assumptions deeply, deeply, deeply embedded in it, that as a lesbian looking at economics, you really have to dig that up. You have to dig it out and pull it apart and those sorts of things. So I'm not sure that I can fully answer the question, but I think it's important to ask the question, just as I think it's important to ask a whole lot of other questions.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. So I wanted to talk to you about lesbianism as a choice, if you're willing to talk about that. When I first tried to come out as a lesbian, there were some women at the Michigan Women's Music Festival that were like, you're not a lesbian. You can't be a lesbian. You weren't born that way, and you've dated men, and so don't appropriate our lesbian culture just because you've failed with men or something like that. And it really discouraged me. And I think we should be encouraging women to be lesbians, and that it'll strengthen our economics, our politics, our culture, our movement, our feminist movement, if women become lesbians. But I know that notion is really touchy for some lesbians, and I know that you've had to deal with that, and so I'm hoping you can address that and talk with us about the difference between choosing to be a lesbian and maybe just being born that way. Is there a difference?
Yeah, there's a very big political difference, I think. I think going down the born that way trail is quite a trap. First of all, it suggests that there is a genetic basis for lesbian sexuality, which I find a huge fabrication. The scientists, you know, who want to make money would love nothing more than that. There is a significant number of gay men who believe that, and I write against that. I have actually written another article called about somatic piracy, and I talk about the way in which the biologicalization or geneticization is actually a better word of sexuality. And I mean, that's the line that the trans ideologues have gone down. So it's a difficult thing, because I'd say the vast majority of lesbians who were activists and out as lesbians in the 1970s had some kind of sexual arrangement with a man at some point, before the idea that, oh, I could have a relationship with a woman. And I mean, I did know what the word lesbian meant, but I had been to a girls' school, so that helped. And but it hadn't crossed my mind that I could live my life as a lesbian. I was certainly not born a lesbian. I resisted a lot of the girly expectations, but that to me is not being a lesbian. Resisting gender is not the same as being a lesbian. My partner, Renate Klein, recently wrote something that she had written for Julie Bindel. And it was actually just like, here's my experience, and yes, you can cite me in your book, but please make sure that you say that, I didn't write this for anything other than your research. Anyway, so Julie loved it so much, she asked Renate if she could put it on her site, which she did. Renate then really copped huge backlash to what she had written, because she said, well, I was married at some stage, but I grew up in Switzerland. I didn't know what a lesbian was. I didn't even know that such a thing existed. And so she was accused of being, not just accused, women said, you are bisexual, get over it. And I mean, lots of the women who were saying these things and had actually been living as lesbians for less time than Renate. I mean, they were women in their 20s and 30s, so anybody who has been living as a lesbian 30, 40, 50 years has certainly been through the traps and knows perfectly well what it is to be a lesbian and is a lesbian. And so I have problems with that on several levels. The word choice bothers me enormously because it's a consumer thing. I prefer to use the word decision, which is something I've learned from Renate over the years. I wrote a blog about this on the Spinifex site, which I called The Best Decision of My Life, which was my coming to see what it was to be a lesbian, to live as a lesbian, to have the joy of lesbian existence. And that for me has been a much better experience than my phase of heterosexuality, which I can only say really was a phase. And I guess that the idea that it's okay to attack women who've been lesbians for decades, and you, the attacker, grew up in a time where the word lesbian was way better known, and think that because of some sort of social, the openness in the social system means that you knew what a lesbian was at a younger age, doesn't mean that you were born that way, because actually when you were born, you knew nothing of that. And Julie had a very good response to one person who said she was born a lesbian. She said, so did you fall in love with the midwife? And nobody is born. We are socially, we grow into our social lives, which is also the reason why the word gender is a problem. No person is ever born in the wrong body. When I fill in forms about my dog and they ask my dog's gender, I say, she doesn't know and she doesn't care.
The vet that you take your dog to asks.
No, not the vet, but we used to take our dogs on airlines. We don't anymore. But if you want to take a dog on an airplane, and you have to then put them into the back of the plane, which is a horrible experience for them. Then they ask you the gender of your dog. And so I'd cross it out and say sex, female. And the same with babies. Babies, they don't give a shit about what their gender is. I mean, they don't have a gender. They have a sex. And it's not about it being observed. It's about having a sex. That's all. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
These seem like they would be very simple things, but the way our society's been going lately, it's very complicated, you know. Your sex is
Hmm.
assigned at birth somehow. It's like the doctor's decision. What? It's very
And
convoluted.
have the doctors not studied biology? It's a bit worrying.
Yeah. Now, I have another question. In terms of feminist movement and women's liberation, do you think as feminist activists we should be encouraging women to be lesbian? Why or why not?
Um, I think that the early women's movement did that extremely successfully. Um, we didn't set out necessarily to say to women, you should be a lesbian. It's just we all fell in love with one another. Or we had such fun together that we wanted to be part of this community. And as well as that, so many of us were engaged in political activism that somehow being able to combine one's political activism, one's social life, and all the other things, cultural life, seemed like a really great idea. And, we would go to women's dances where women's bands were playing. We would go to theatre, showed that had been devised all by women and performed by women and directed by women and lighting by women, all of these things. And that created, it was like it created a soup for women to go, what a good idea. Maybe I'm a lesbian. And yeah, and what happens after that varies. Some became lesbians, some did not. Some had a relationship or two and then thought it wasn't for them. So, I don't actually believe in conversion, mass conversion, whatever, of any group. But I think if we make being a lesbian such a joyful thing, then women will come. I also think, there are some real pluses to being lesbian. You can completely stop thinking about reproduction. I mean, some lesbians have already reproduced. That means they have children, but they're not likely to get pregnant unless they're with a man who calls himself a lesbian and they forget that they need to protect themselves. Um, yeah. So there are actually very many health benefits to being a lesbian. And while lesbians are sometimes attacked on the streets, lesbians are raped, lesbians are tortured, lesbians are murdered. The problem of domestic violence and the killing of heterosexual women in intimate relationships is at pandemic level. And I think actually it's worse. I think that women in heterosexual relationships with men who they thought loved them are copping a very bad deal at the moment. So yeah, I think there are many pluses to being a lesbian, but I think it also depends where in the world you live. And if you live in a country where it is illegal to be a lesbian, where you can be jailed, you can be raped, you can be tortured, you can be executed for that decision, and you want to leave and you can't leave because everything is stacked against you, then that's a very hard road to go down. So, there are pluses and definite minuses depending on where in the world you live. That that, but not always that. I mean, women in the US and in Australia who've been jailed for one reason or another have often also been raped in the jail, or they've been incarcerated in a mental institution because they were considered to be hooligans or, riffraff.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think conversion is not on my agenda.
Or lesbianism as a political strategy that leads us towards women's liberation. you don't think
Yeah.
along those lines, or you do?
Yes, 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 definitely, definitely.
Definitely. So,
Definitely, because lesbians have been the backbone of the women's liberation movement, have been the backbone of developing a culture and the backbone of, leading political engagements. I mean, look at things like WDI, look at Wolf in Australia, look at we have an organisation of which I'm a member, Coalition of Activist Lesbians. There are other organisations as well. There's Matrix that purchases houses for older lesbians so they have somewhere to live. And there are other groups as well. These are critical to the survival of the women's liberation movement.
okay, yeah, I definitely think that lesbianism enhances our feeling of solidarity and sisterhood amongst comrades in the women's liberation movement. And you have um, more of a horse in the game when you're a lesbian. Like you really you want to protect yourself and your sisters. Um,
Yes.
and I think lesbianism really helps with that. So, without a doubt, one of the most common ways women are dominated by men is through heterosexual culture and politics. Can heterosexual women break free from male dominance in their lives if they're intimately involved with men or a man? What about the good guys out there? You were sort of talking about that at the very beginning of our conversation. Those guys who don't want to harm women. Is it wrong for women to seek out these types of males for relationships? What about our brothers, our sons, our fathers, our neighbors, and other men in our lives? How can we reconcile feeling affection for and closeness to men in our lives, whether lesbian or not? To what extent is it inescapable that women be in relationship with at least some men in our lives? And isn't that desirable?
Yes, I think there are some reasons why it is, but I also think that it's not our job as lesbians to fix men. When the women's liberation movement really exploded in the late 60s, early 70s, we didn't ask the men to help us. We actually went in, we did it ourselves, we invented consciousness raising. Well, we didn't invent that, came from China. We invented consciousness raising groups. We sat down, we talked to one another. We worked out that our problems with the patriarchy were not personal problems, they were systemic political problems, and we set about to change that. Men need to do that. Men need to start talking to one another. They need to stop getting all the gains. They need to step back and say to themselves, how can I stop this behaviour? There's been a little bit of that in terms of blacks and whites, that some white people feel they have an obligation to fight against their internalized and racism that has come about because of this social system. But very few managed men see any need to or any requirement to do that vis-a-vis women. Robert Jensen has written a very good book, which of course published by Spinifex, called The End of Patriarchy, Radical Feminism for Men. And he basically writes about that. He says, as a man, I have a responsibility, if I see myself as a partially progressive human being, I have a responsibility to work on those things in terms of men and my relationships with other men and the ways in which I have relationships with women. Now, if we could clone Bob, which of course I don't believe in cloning, but if we could make, Bob a more viable kind of, many more men like him, the world would be in a better place. But it doesn't look like that's happening when you look around and you see Donald Trump and you see our Prime Minister, our opposition leader, Peter Dutton, even our Prime Minister, who's not as bad, but Anthony Albanese. But nevertheless, most of the men in power are not the type of men who are going to step back and say, am I right to do this? I mean, look at Boris Johnson and the Hungarians and Erdogan in Turkey and Putin. It actually makes you really quite anxious, even to think about it. So it's not our job to fix those men, but if we can put out our ideas, try and spread the kinds of philosophies that we hold, to write about coming into the world in a different way, to be ecologically sensitive, to be anti-racist, to be anti-misogynist, to be all these things, to not put people in a box because they have a disability or because they speak a different language. I mean, those things are just, that's where I think lesbians can contribute, socially speaking, politically speaking. It won't be down to any one of us. It's down to masses and masses of us doing that kind of work. And a little bit of hope, I guess, that some men in some places begin to behave differently, begin to do the internal work that women have done over the last few decades. Unfortunately, some have gone backwards, but still, there is nevertheless more hope at this stage, at this point in history, among women than there is among men. I'm more than happy that we published Robert Jensen's book, and I hope that he manages to convince men out there to do the sort of work that he's done. So that's a sort of enabling thing, but it's not going to fix it, but perhaps it makes some difference. And his book has sold very well. It's very frustrating. We joked with him about this. Bob, it's really frustrating to publish you because we keep selling more of your books. And look at all these women, these fabulous feminists we're publishing, and we're having trouble, selling their books. You have an advantage, even though you don't know it, even though you do know it.
I mean, definitely there's
Yeah.
male privilege as part of that,
Yeah, I mean, he's perfectly aware of that, and he's very humble. But on the other hand, we have fabulous feminist writers who've been writing for decades, women like Robin Morgan and Janice Raymond, and more recently Jennifer Bilek, and Sheila Jeffries. I mean, lots and lots and lots of
Aurora Linnea.
Aurora Linnea, whose book is about to come out, and Betty McClellan,
We're
whose
so
book was
excited. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, again, switching gears, I read the essay, The Aerial Lesbian Body, and then I went to bed and I slept, and I got up and I did my regular yoga practice the next morning, and I experienced my 56-year-old body in a different way. Can you talk about women's relationship that we have with our own bodies, but with other women's bodies? And something that I really started thinking about is like yoga classes, water aerobics classes, free movement dance classes are often dominated by women. And what does that say? The instructors are usually women, at least over here in the United States. In my experience, it's been that way. What does that say about our relationship that we have with our bodies and the potential for, getting women pumped up and organized through the relationship that we have with each other, with ourselves, and our bodies?
Well, what prompted me to write that article was because of my experience in women's circuses, especially the performing older women's circus. We had to be over 40 to be able to join, which some people said, oh, don't be ridiculous. You know, women over 40 can't do circus. Well, actually, you can. And really, until probably the last 2 years, you know, my ability to do a handstand and stuff like that, and I'm 72 now, 73 next month, has actually been much better than it ever was early in my life. And, you know, learning doing acrobatics, doing aerials, gave me an enormous amount of strength. When I first started, I couldn't climb a rope. And I did learn, and as I got stronger, I learned to be able to do that and much more, to the point where I was able to perform some really good tricks. And the other thing I learned was about trust, and that particularly the performing older women's circus, the thing about learning to be a flyer or a base was interesting. I'm more naturally a flyer because I would be a bird if I could be, but sadly I don't have wings. So I initially went to being a flyer, and other women who didn't have that sense of themselves initially went to being bases. So the bases would work with us flyers and so forth. But as I got stronger, I also discovered that I could be a base as well. And that some of the women who had previously just seen themselves as bases, who had seen themselves primarily as very strong women, also gave themselves permission to learn flying. So that for me was a really good lesson, just in terms of assumptions about what you can and you can't do. Now, in terms of yoga, I do yoga. I'm not. I'm a bit. What's the word? Sometimes I go for weeks and weeks and weeks on it, and then I miss classes for months and months, and that's how it is. But I love doing yoga. It's a very different thing from circus, although in circus, yoga was often used as part of our warm-ups. And I think it is interesting. I mean, all of the yoga teachers near where I live are all women. The classes that I go to, there might be 10 women and 1 man, and he would mostly come and then he'd drop out and then he'd come, you know, it'd be very inconsistent. And I think that for women, knowing our bodies, understanding our bodies, being able to move them in whatever way, whether it's dance or whether it's yoga or whether it's circus or whether it's lifting weights, all those things are important. For men, I think it's very hard for them to break through the barrier that's not huffing and puffing in a gym. Most men who exercise do it that way. There are a few men who do yoga, and then the men who teach yoga usually have grown up with yoga around them all their lives. You know, they come from India, or they've grown up with a mother who's a yoga teacher, and, you know, whatever. So, or they've been dancers, you know, so, but there are nowhere near as many of them. But when the men who teach yoga or dance also often are much better paid than the women. So the system still works even there. And I think that having an understanding of how one's own body works, what are your strengths and what are your, not so much weaknesses, but what are the things you might work on a little more, that they're important. And it actually helps you to recover if for some reason you have an injury. You're more likely to recover quickly if you have a good relationship with your body. And yeah, I guess that's kind of where I would end up on that question. I think it is an interesting one, and I think that women in the last 30 odd years have become much more aware of that. And, you know, I mean, I was reading an article yesterday about bushwalking in Australia, and there was a bushwalking club that set up in Melbourne in the 1920s. And, you know, it was a scandal. Here were these women going out in the bush and walking by themselves. And eventually some of them started wearing shorts. Oh, my God. You know, now that has obviously changed enormously. But these are the battles that we've actually had to fight to get to a point where we might really love our bodies and be able to use and trust them to do heavy work every now and again, to be able to fix things, to be able to start, I don't know, a lawnmower or a generator, as we need to here in the cyclone areas. You know, to be able to think about the things that you do, to use a hammer effectively, even if it does require nails.
Yeah, the phallic nail or whatever it was that you were thinking about those things. Yeah. Well, you know, body hatred has always been a huge problem amongst women, and learning to live in our bodies and love our bodies, I think, is a big part of our own personal women's liberation that we
Mm-hmm.
can feel as individuals. And so I personally think it's great that most yoga classes are full of women, and I see a lot of potential there for forming female friendships and body loving habits that we can do together in groups, you know. So I encourage all of my sisters to get in touch with your body and feel yourself. Your body is yourself. You know, we live inside of ourselves, our bodies, and so it's key to me to be a good feminist, to be an effective feminist. We need to take body loving seriously as an agenda point in women's liberation. Um, so to wrap it up, I'm just gonna put the book up on the screen one more time. This is Susan Hawthorne's new book. It's a collection of essays and works that she created throughout the years, and published by Spinifex Press. It's wonderful. Can you tell women why they should read this book? And also, can you leave us with your hopes for a lesbian feminist future?
How many more hours do you have?
Yeah.
Um, well, I think what's important about it is that basically the material in it has been written over 50 years, almost 50 years. So it is a historical document, and it shows the way that my thinking was, you know, 50 odd years ago, and how it changed over the years, how it developed, how sometimes I actually disagree with myself now and again, thinking back on something that I wrote. So I have a little footnote saying I now disagree with this, because I think it's important to recognize that we don't always think the same way all our lives. But I also think it's really important that those of us who disagree with one another are able to talk to one another and not just dismiss somebody because they've got pink eyes or whatever, you know. I mean, just whatever the strange thing is. So I think the fact that a historical document is really important, that it's about politics, and it's about the development of culture. There's a whole lot of culture that exists now, even in the mainstream, that wouldn't have been possible without the women's movement behind it. A lot of great women's movement ideas have been appropriated and commercialized. But that's capitalism for you. It gave me the chance to write an essay about my friend Suzanne Bellamy, which is the final essay in the work in the book. An absolutely brilliant artist, theorist, thinker, activist, who I had a very long friendship with since the early 80s. And it's her artwork that is on the cover of the book. And there are many other works of art by her that I could have put, but these were very personal ones, so I decided to use them. And because of that, that connection has been important in terms of my development of my thinking as well, because we challenged one another. We worked together on a number of projects, and that was always a huge amount of fun. I think it's also what I discovered doing it was that I started with writing about separatism, and towards the end I have another article in which I gave at a conference in Germany, which I come back to that. I'll come back to some of the things that I wrote there. And I think that separatism is just as important now as it was back in 1976 when I wrote that article, the original piece. But it feels slightly different now than what it did then. It's also very international. I'm Australian, and Australians travel. Almost every Australian has a passport, which I know is very different from the US. And it's very much built on my experience as an Australian, but also from New Zealand friends as well, because we live in the same part of the world. Sometimes we Australians are bossy, but the New Zealanders are very good at fighting back. It's international because that's I think internationally. It covers, certainly Australian feminism was very much influenced by the USA and the UK, particularly in the 70s, 80s, and still now, and some parts are not good. But we're also influenced by our connections with places like India. Indian culture is really quite similar to Australian, as I discovered. Everybody plays cricket. Our political systems are quite similar because of our shared colonisation from the UK. And the same is true of some African countries as well. And, because I have travelled quite a bit, and I've lived in some places over an extended period of time, I have some experience of how it works in other places. And I'm interested in that. I'm interested in more than just my Australian experience, because feminism is a global movement, and it needs to continue as a global movement, and we need to support the women who are doing it much tougher than we are. There are some difficult things here, but oh boy, they're far worse in many other countries, and I want that to be obvious, and that's why I wrote what I did about the torture of lesbians and what's happening there. So, in a place like South Africa, lesbians are technically supported by the Constitution. Lesbians are included in the Constitution, extraordinarily. But lesbians are also subjected to a huge amount of corrective rape. That is rape that is meant to turn you heterosexual. What peculiar thinking is that? Yeah, and I cover that in a very long essay in the book as well. So I hope that gives women a lot of different reasons for it. And it's got 3 poems in it as well, if you like poetry. And if you don't, there's only 3, so you can skip them.
Well, it's great to have a mix of prose and poetry, and to have such dense theory also in some of the essays, but also you telling your life story in other essays. And so there's a lot of variety in the writing style, and in what you say too. So thank you for the beautiful book. And if you could just tell us what are your hopes for a lesbian feminist future? What do you see on the horizon? What do you hope to see on the horizon for lesbians?
Well, they're not too dissimilar from the hopes I had 50 odd years ago. Um, I hope I hope that lesbians would be far more visible. Now, to some extent, we have managed that, but there is a lot of resistance to us being visible still, and a lot of pushback. So I would like to live in a world where lesbians are recognized as lesbians, celebrated as lesbians. I want everybody to use the word lesbian as often as possible, and not have people squirm when you say I'm a lesbian. I want the sense of shame to be dropped from women saying that they're lesbians. I would like some of the lesbian thinking to be recognised into the systems of power. I think this is highly unlikely, but there is no point in not hoping.
Yeah.
And I think the more of us who write about this, the more of us who act on these sorts of things, then the more likely it is to happen. It will have to happen along with a whole lot of other things as well, in terms of ecological sustainability, in terms of treating
Yeah, if we don't
people
have
with
an
world
environment to
decency.
live in, we don't have lesbians, we don't have anybody, you know. So yeah,
That's exactly right.
sustainability
We
is,
won't have any animals either.
yeah. So it's a crazy world that we're living in right now, Susan, and I appreciate so much that you have taken out some time today to speak with me and to promote your wonderful book. I hope all of our WLRN listeners out there um, will get this book and order other books from Spinifex Press. Support your work, and yeah, thanks again.
And you can go to the Spinifex website, which is www.spinifexpress, all one word, .com.au. Don't forget the .au at the end, because
Okay.
that's the
And we
Australia
can
bit.
have that, we'll
And
have that
if
in the
you,
description underneath the interview too. If you send, I've got the link already so that women can just click after they watch
okay.
this interview. They're going to be all jazzed and they're going to click and get the book.
And
So yeah,
well, thank you
thanks
so much
again.
for talking with me. It's been a pleasure, a real pleasure.
Thank you to Susan Hawthorne for the wonderful conversation. This is Anne Castile, producer and sound engineer for WLRN. As someone who spends a lot of my free time reading feminist fiction, Spinifex Press has been a wealth of literature for me. You can learn more about Spinifex Press, purchase Susan's book, and explore their entire catalog at spinifexpress.com.au. I also recommend reaching out to your local public library. Ask them to subscribe to Spinifex Press. This will allow your entire community to have access to their titles, including Susan's latest work and WLRN's own Aurora Linea's new release, Man Against Being, Body Horror and the Death of Life. To explore WLRN's library of podcast episodes, videos, and more, visit WLRNmedia.com. Thanks for tuning in.